70 years ago, Britain was fighting for its life. For the country, this was a crossroads. For artists, it was a moment of truth.
This is Battle of Britain by Paul Nash. It's a towering, dreamlike, visionary work by arguably the greatest British war artist of the last century. But powerful as it is, it's only one small part of an even more extraordinary story.
The Second World War saw an explosion of art in Britain.
That's the farmer.
No, I'm talking about this.
Domestic scenes and satirical cartoons. Colourful propaganda and searing images of suffering.
They had never dealt with anything even remotely like this before. It was a whole new subject for them.
There was new art for new audiences.
I was mesmerised really with it. I used to watch her doing it, you know. It was perfect, everything was perfect.
World War II produced some of the most intense and haunting images of the 20th century.
It seems to get more powerful, oddly enough, the further away from it we get.
This is the story of how British art went to war, how the war changed art, and how the art changed us.
As the Second World War raged in Europe, a secret operation took place at an underground quarry in North Wales. Beneath a mountain of solid rock, Britain's greatest art treasures were placed into deep storage. Paintings by Renoir and Raphael, Gainsborough and Constable were safe at last from air raids or invasion forces.
Of course, burying the nation's priceless masterpieces underground was a sensible precaution, but it also chimed with a prevailing mood of pessimism. For many people, at the beginning of the war, it seemed like civilization itself was in retreat. But there was one man who believed that art shouldn't just hide from the conflict, but should confront it head-on.
An artist can see new combinations of shapes and colours which most of us take for granted, but which will probably convey the feel of the war to posterity far more vividly than a photographic record could do.
Kenneth Clark was a prodigy. In 1934, aged only 30, he'd been appointed director of the National Gallery. Clark had talent, he had ambition, and he had influence.
He was one of these people who he knew everybody who was anybody. He knew the royal family well. He'd have Winston Churchill around for dinner. His area of interest was the Italian Renaissance. That's where he made his mark early on. But he had his finger on the pulse very much in terms of British art.
At the same time as he oversaw the evacuation of the National Gallery's collection, Kenneth Clark was hard at work on another scheme. He knew the looming conflict would change Britain forever, and he wanted art to be at the centre of that change.
He was really determined that people would come to understand and love art. I think he used the War Art Project to convince people that art was not only useful in war, but also something that could enrich their lives, that could make them better citizens, that could make Britain a better country.
The War Artists Advisory Committee was Kenneth Clark's brainchild. This small government group organised artists' wartime assignments. It also used its significant budget to commission and purchase war art. By the end of the conflict, the Ministry of Information had channeled more than £50,000 into Clark's committee, well over £1.5 million in today's terms.
Nowadays, we would find it almost impossible to imagine a government of any kind commissioning art on the scale that they did during the Second World War. It's quite astounding.
The war was only a few weeks old when the War Artists Advisory Committee first met here at the National Gallery. Clark, the most famous connoisseur in the country, sat alongside several other grandees from Britain's art establishment, as well as a handful of stiff upper lip types who represented the armed forces. Not really a bunch of hot-headed revolutionaries, but by the time the war had ended, these mandarins had masterminded an astonishing collection of some 6,000 works of art by more than 400 artists. Along the way, they democratised visual culture and transformed British art.
And now we are privileged to show you the first pictures of British units moving up to the front line.
As British forces arrived in France in September 1939, Kenneth Clark's committee began to commission its first war artists. Among them was the illustrator Edward Ardisoni. He would become the most prolific and longest-serving of Clark's war artists, documenting life among the British troops right up until the German surrender in 1945. Matthew Cook is a war artist with experience in Iraq and Afghanistan.
One of the things that I love about Ardisoni is that so often you're not seeing all the action at the front line. I mean, here, for instance, they seem to have found, I don't know, is that a bottle of wine? They're drinking.
That's where drawing comes in. I'm sure the photographers were more interested in the actual front line, the bombs and the bullets, whereas if you're drawing, you could make what wouldn't catch many people's eye far more fascinating and very personal.
This, it feels quite irreverent, and it's got that sort of bawdy, quite earthy quality. It's like Ardisoni loves depicting common experience, the experience of the ordinary Tommy, whereas the officer class, like in this image, he loved to caricature these people.
Yeah, this has got a scary-looking bunch of monocled officers and bulging eyes.
And misshapen noses.
Yes, yes. This is a bit of a caricature, again, of a padre having his boots pulled off. Edward Ardisoni had some wonderful boots made for him before he went out, but they absolutely killed his feet. And on the retreat back through France, he left his boots somewhere, and I think he sort of prayed that a German officer would pick them up at some point and it would cause just as much harm to his feet.
The curse of the boots.
Yes, the dreaded boots.
So this is from hard-earned personal experience.
Obviously, obviously.
Following your experience of making pictures in war zones, do you find that that affects the way you look at images by Ardisoni? Do you look at them with more respect, perhaps, because you've been a war artist yourself?
Yes, I can understand the scale he draws, because obviously you want sketchbooks to be tucked into a bag, something you can carry with you easily. It's got some wonderful small sketches here. I find these often more telling than some of the worked up drawings.
Ardisoni's not without his critics. Do you think that he did manage to capture something of the essence of being on the front line, or do you think he was just a bit of a lightweight?
No, I don't think he was a lightweight. In fact, I like the sort of juxtaposition of his slightly caricatured figures and the seriousness of what's going on. I find that was almost makes them slightly more edgy than if it was a serious sketch.
The war began abroad, but in September 1940, the Blitz brought it home. Suddenly, everyone was on the front line.
It's a very different war from the point of view of art and human experience. So many of the best pictures are to do with not things that happened way, way abroad, but on your doorstep. And in a way that makes it more real, more painful, more kind of shocking even to us to look at now.
By the end of May 1941, 43,000 British civilians had been killed by enemy bombing. And yet among the dozens of paintings and sketches produced during the Blitz, there's one subject that's conspicuous by its absence.
The number of actual bodies one sees in Blitz art is relatively small. One could be forgiven for thinking that it happened in a country that had very few people living in it. Lots of great architecture, but not a whole lot of people.
Voyeurism was always a risk and always a danger. You certainly get that sense from the artists themselves. Certainly Graham Sutherland chose to go out and work in wastelands around the city of London, simply because he felt uncomfortable witnessing people who had been made homeless during the Blitz.
Like Ardisoni, Graham Sutherland was an official war artist. Clark's committee gave him a salary rather than occasional commissions. But Sutherland wasn't the most obvious choice to paint scenes of urban devastation.
Before 1939, Sutherland was a landscape artist who went out there into the deep countryside and got very involved with the sky and the sea, darkness and light. So if anyone had predicted that he would start doing pictures of the Blitz, nobody would have believed him.
Sutherland produced an intense, brooding vision of bomb-ravaged London.
I think the Graham Sutherland Blitz pictures are among the most important things produced in the war. They are incredibly powerful works. The architecture stands in for human bodies so that buildings are portrayed as if they were damaged human bodies. It's impossible to look at these works and not see the human references in them.
The next station is Leicester Square.
Graham Sutherland reached for metaphors to describe human form. But another artist would depict the vulnerable body in a much more direct way.
One of the most moving scenes of the Blitz was the sight of the tube shelterers. On almost any night during a raid, this figure might have been seen wandering about. Henry Moore, the sculptor. Here, perhaps, was the one artist most capable of immortalizing the stoic endurance and suffering of these people.
Henry Moore's shelter sketches have become some of the most recognizable images to emerge from the Second World War. They caused a sensation at the time, and Clark was quick to purchase some of the pieces for the official war art scheme. Here were images that fulfilled his ambitions for art that would resonate deeply with the lives of ordinary people.
Alf, I think I'm right in saying that during the Blitz you used to shelter a lot underground in the tube stations.
Yes. We sheltered many different places until we found the underground and they let us go down there. But in the underground, you couldn't hear nothing. People went down there for that reason.
So you couldn't hear the bombs?
You couldn't hear nothing at all. This picture, can I talk about this picture?
Of course.
Picture there, that's how we slept.
Well, to me, this looks very claustrophobic and...
It is claustrophobic. The air in there was thick.
I know that you were involved in a really awful disaster. Could you tell me what happened that evening, that night?
Yes, as if it was yesterday. On the 3rd of March 1943, around about 5 to 8, the sirens started. So we ran across the road to where the tube was, the Bethnal Green tube. Well, everybody was walking down the stairs, just like any other night. And just as we got to the middle of the staircase, this tremendous noise flew up. And they called out, "There's a bomb, get down, get down, get down." At that point, 2 buses had arrived and all them people clambered off the bus and made for the shelter. And they pushed forward. And I was wedged up against the wall. Well, by that time, the people, children, ladies, everybody was falling. They was falling all down by the side of me. I couldn't lift myself to go forward. I could move my arms and I could, wanted to get out, couldn't get out. Then a lady air raid warden, she laid across the bodies and grabbed me and went like that, out. And she pulled, and almost half come out.
What happened to the other people who were left behind in the stairwell?
They died. They were some of the 173 people who passed away. Children. Children are gone. You never see them no more.
The Bethnal Green tube disaster was hushed up by the government. They didn't want the public to believe that the underground shelters were anything other than safe. Wartime propaganda put a spin on Moore's sketches. In the Ministry of Information-funded documentary Out of Chaos, images of sleeping women became part of the official story of bravery and endurance.
This isn't just a drawing of two people sleeping. Henry Moore has discovered the very rhythm of sleep. A great rolling movement runs across the drawing, like a broad Atlantic swell. It's an oasis of tranquility in the heart of a nightmare.
At the time, Moore's shelter drawings were praised for turning squalid scenes into something heroic and celebrating the quiet stoicism of the Londoners who'd been battered by the Blitz. But I'm not so sure. To me, they feel rather dark and disturbing. Moore's underground scenes look like a necropolis, the people ossified and mummified like piles of brittle bones. They appear to be set in a shadowy realm that might represent the limbo between this world and the next, and speak to me of the waste and loss of life engendered by war. There's no doubt that they're saturated by the experience of war, though the conflict that haunted Moore's imagination wasn't so much the Second World War as the one that had devastated Europe more than 2 decades earlier.
The First World War seared itself onto the psyche of an entire generation of artists. As a 19-year-old, Henry Moore had been gassed on the Western Front. It's hard not to see in his later shelter sketches the shadows of all those heaped-up bodies in no man's land. For the young Henry Moore, it was an overwhelming experience. He wasn't the only artist whose work during the Second World War would be deeply coloured by what he'd witnessed in the trenches. There was one painter in particular whose creative life became defined by conflict.
If I have to name one artist who stands out in the First World War, it would be Paul Nash. There's one painting in particular called We Are Making a New World, which is quite shattering because it shows the scene that confronted Nash when he went back to Passchendaele. All that was left were just mud craters filled with water, trees that had been shorn of everything except their bare trunks. Nature itself had somehow come to an end.
For Paul Nash, humanity too seemed to have run its course. The new world that Europe made in the 20s and 30s was one of intolerance and impending crisis. Nash knew he had to take a stand. When Kenneth Clark secured him a commission with the RAF in 1940, Nash seized on the opportunity to combine art with anti-Nazi propaganda. He found his inspiration in a dump for crashed aircraft near Cowley in Oxfordshire. Here was tangible evidence that Nazi air power could be brought to Earth, could be destroyed. From these twisted fragments, Paul Nash would create one of the greatest masterpieces of the Second World War, Totes Meer, or Dead Sea.
Totes Meer is a distillation of all that Nash has seen and done and thought about as an artist. He's taken the Nazi imperialism, Nazi values, and embedded them into a landscape of his own making. It's not just a fanciful set of symbols. It's a very clear image of defeat.
You might think the painting's anti-Nazi message was obvious enough, prophesying the destruction of the Third Reich. But for Nash, it wasn't obvious enough. So he had this made up. It's a surreal montage of Totes Meer superimposed with Hitler's face. It looks a bit like the smashed-up head of a colossal statue of the Führer that's been toppled, really ramming home the message that the end was nigh for his evil empire. Nash wanted thousands of postcards of this image to be dropped over Germany. The only trouble was the RAF didn't want this kind of propaganda. This was much more to their taste. It's a portrait of the legendary RAF pilot Douglas Bader, and you can imagine it hanging on the wall of the officers' mess. To them, Totes Meer would have seemed very weird, a bit unreal, and maybe a little bit morbid. Kenneth Clarke had no such qualms about Nash's painting. To him, Totes Meer was an indisputable masterpiece, a complex, nuanced work of art rather than mere propaganda.
Kenneth Clarke was very against any prescriptive instructions to artists. What he was, I think, quite clear about is he didn't want propaganda. This was not the aim of the War Artists Committee. He felt that propaganda didn't produce good art. Propaganda aims didn't produce good art. But of course there is a paradox there, because he's taken on to head the film unit, which of course was primarily there to produce propaganda.
The Ministry of Information didn't just fund Kenneth Clarke's art scheme, it also funded commercial movies. In 1940, Clarke was appointed head of its film division. When it came to cinema, he was no ivory tower idealist. Clarke was particularly eager that films should highlight the brutality of Nazi occupying forces. Night Train to Munich, produced during his tenure at the film division, makes that propaganda message loud and clear. It's a wake-up call, warning the British public about a regime of concentration camps and arbitrary arrest.
Turn right. Edward Clyde, for laziness, sentence 12 lashes.
My heart will never stand it here, Doctor.
Fast fit.
I have been under treatment.
Take him away.
Doctor.
Next man.
It might seem like Kenneth Clarke had a finger in every wartime pie. But not every aspect of visual culture was under his control. Away from his influence, a kaleidoscope of popular art forms burst onto Britain's consciousness, shaping opinions and transforming attitudes. New Zealander David Lowe was one of the most gifted cartoon artists of the day. His satirical images targeted his enemies like precision propaganda weapons.
Lowe always felt that it was more important to lampoon and ridicule the dictators rather than make them fearsome and terrifying. We know that Lowe's cartoons really annoyed Hitler, and Lowe was on sort of hit lists, the equivalent of hit lists. And so the suggestion was, if Germany ever invaded, people like Lowe would very quickly find themselves in front of the firing squad. And I suppose it's always the cartoonist's dream to get under the skin, and obviously you can't do better than that somebody actually would like you dead.
Cartoonists like Lowe had a real impact. Their punchy pictures reached huge audiences every day. But there was another form of popular visual art which was even more ubiquitous. Public information posters were an inescapable feature of the wartime landscape. Produced as propaganda in vast numbers by the government, these eye-catching images changed the way Britain looked.
Richard, these posters look incredibly familiar, particularly this one, Keep Calm and Carry On. You see it today printed on cards, on mugs.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's quite a tongue-in-cheek message today, but
Yes.
when does it date from in the war?
It dates right from the very beginning of the war in 1939.
How were they received by the British public?
Not very well, as it turned out. The press were immediately scathing. The Times, for example, described this one as a patronising and insipid invocation. And
well, they were right, really, weren't they?
Yes,
they're very patronising. An image like this one, though, which is really very famous indeed and is often reproduced, this must have felt so different to what came before.
Yeah, here it is in a nutshell. This epic quality, this kind of like upward shot, which gives it, this kind of grandeur to this very sort of mundane task of kitchen gardening. But there it is, the booted foot. It's the ordinary person. It's the people's war.
Yes. I can't help spotting this poster behind, because this, to me, looks a bit like a poster for a film by Hitchcock.
Yes, I mean, this was a road safety campaign, the Blackout, and it was very, very successful indeed. It cut the accidents by almost a quarter.
This poster could be a piece of surrealist art.
Exactly. I mean, it does look like a Man Ray surrealist photograph. The thing with posters like this, you get two for the price of one. And it's straight out of Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin, isn't it? All it's doing is warning you to be careful, protect your eyes. But what you get is this, fabulous image.
It's interesting because the design of a poster like this feels very, very bold and new and quite exciting. And in a way, all of these posters have become more iconic of the Second World War than some of the paintings and prints and drawings commissioned by Kenneth Clark.
It's the ubiquity of them that the public got to see them. They were displayed outside. But at the same time, we've got this great surge of design innovation. This is by Abraham Games, for example. In 1941, he was summoned to the War Office. We want you to be our in-house designer. And, that was an opportunity that Games seized with both hands, and he demanded absolute independence. But that independence sometimes landed him in trouble, and this poster was one example.
Well, she looks very glamorous, doesn't she?
Well,
you can't help noticing this extremely bright red lipstick.
Yes, but he was considered to be a little bit too glamorous and a bit too much of a risque image for impressionable young recruits.
This was considered too risque at the time?
Yes, it was considered to not the right sort of image.
Games's glamorous ATS girl caused an outcry. There were public complaints. MPs asked questions. The poster became the focus of anxieties about easy morals and newly liberated desires.
London during the war was a pretty racy, raffish place. Swarms of prostitutes, the legendary Piccadilly Commandos, worked the West End, while the Windmill Theatre, famous for its nude revue, boasted that it never closed, even at the height of the Blitz.
No popular art form captured this new mood better than the Daily Mirror's Jane strip. Throughout the war, Jane battled fifth columnists and dastardly Nazis, somehow losing most of her clothes in the process.
Somebody did a survey, and I think in 232 out of 260 strips, she lost something or exposed something or other. But there was always the sense that she was a good girl. She was doing her bit for the war effort. I suppose in that way she helped keep morale up.
Jane had a pretty potent effect on troop morale, so much so that Winston Churchill called her Britain's secret weapon. And on the day that she finally stripped off, the British 6th Division reportedly advanced 6 miles.
Naughty but nice Jane was one of the most famous icons of wartime femininity. But women played a much more important role in war art than as pin-ups. The The painter Evelyn Dunbar became a key figure in documenting life on the home front.
Evelyn Dunbar had submitted some pictures of the Women's Land Army, and the committee was highly impressed by them and thought that this was someone worth pursuing. But it was also clear that Evelyn Dunbar was in imminent danger of being conscripted into war work. And as was the case with so many other artists, Kenneth Clark stepped in and thought, okay, this is someone whose real contribution to the war could be as an artist.
Down on the farm, the land girls are doing their bit and a bit more. And after the grooming, the milking by special method. As you can see, business is pressing.
Clark asked Dunbar to return to the subject that had so impressed him, the land girls. These were the young women drafted in from all corners of the country to work on Britain's farms.
Well, these are two paintings done by Evelyn Dunbar. How do you feel when you actually look at these? Do you feel that these, does it take you back? Does it record some of the experience that you had? I mean, did you have to kind of learn how to milk a cow on these strange machines?
Not really. Somebody just said to me, one of the cowmen said, have you ever milked a cow? And I said, no. And he said, well, come on, I'll give you a bucket and stool. And there I was underneath a very placid cow.
He gave you a live cow?
He gave me a real cow.
So you just told her? You had no experience at all?
No,
I mean, what was a typical day like to be in the Women's Land Army? How early would you get up?
Get up at 5 o'clock, walk across the fields, winter and summer, get the cows in, and then you'd wash them, clean them.
This would take you through to about lunchtime?
No, this was... No,
I'm a city boy.
No, we used to have to go home about 8 o'clock for breakfast. Yeah, and then when we went back, we had to clean out the cow stall and get rid of all the muck and everything, and then get them all nice and fresh and paid up for when they come in.
Now I was a field worker, and to go out into the fields, freezing cold, trying to do sugar beet with a knife,
that's right.
and things like that was hell.
I mean, do you feel, when looking at this top painting, there are obviously several different women together.
Yes.
Was it that you'd be chucked together with people you just didn't know at all?
Absolutely.
And how was that? I mean...
Well, it depends on whether you were, as I say, a shy and timid person or an outgoing person. And some of them would go and hide and wouldn't undress in front of the others.
Really?
Yeah.
People quite coy.
Yeah, because in that day it meant something. I mean, and then people like me hanging out the window in a nightdress.
You were one of the outgoing ones?
Yes, I was.
See,
yeah, I was never sure.
Evelyn Dunbar was the only woman to receive a salary from Clark's committee, but another female artist had already made a name for herself in the cosy male-dominated art scene. Laura Knight was the first woman to be elected a full academician at that bastion of the art establishment, the Royal Academy. Her colourful pre-war paintings of showgirls and circus performers came with eye-watering price tags.
Dame Laura Knight was a fascinating figure. She was feisty, she was photogenic, she boasted that she had no idea how to boil an egg. So she cast herself as almost the anti-housewife. She was exactly what the committee wanted in many ways, someone who was prepared to go out and find opportunities and record them in a compelling way that had a broad public.
In 1942, Laura Knight accepted a commission from Clark's committee to paint a new portrait. The subject was a female munitions worker called Ruby Loftus.
Most talked of Royal Academy exhibit this year is Dame Laura Knight's picture of Ruby Loftus. Miss Loftus is 21. Before being trained to work in an RO factory, she was a shop assistant. Like thousands of girls, she's shown considerable aptitude for war work. Dame Laura has infused an urgency and vitality into this study of woman at work.
And here she is, Ruby Loftus, hard at work. Now, to be honest, I find this painting a little bit on the boring side. And I think that's because Laura Knight's style, that brand of heroic naturalism, is so resolutely realistic and detailed. It feels very academic. There's not much evidence of that personal vision, that sense of interpretation that you find in paintings by, say, Paul Nash or Graham Sutherland. But when this was first shown at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in 1943, it proved incredibly popular. It was reproduced countless times in newspapers, and there were even copies distributed to factory canteens. Ruby became a star. She became a poster girl for the war effort and a figurehead for strong, independent working women.
The Ministry of Information film Night Shift documented life at the munitions factory in South Wales, where Ruby Loftus was one of an almost exclusively female workforce. Pictured here is Ruby's friend and colleague, Iris Watts.
She was non-stop. When we worked 12-hour shifts, which we did from 8 in the morning to late at night, in the winter, you know, you'd go in and it was dark, you'd come off, it was dark. We never saw daylight.
How many people were employed in the factory?
Oh, I think there must have been about 2,000, I should imagine, on different shifts. I was on Ruby Loftus's shift, you see. She was on the same shift as I was on. And in the next bay, of course, that's why I could see everything that was going on with this painting.
Was it at all difficult for Dame Laura? Because the conditions must have been quite tough for an artist.
Yes, yeah, it was, I suppose. You go in and you think, oh my God, you couldn't stand it because of all the machinery going.
After the painting was first shown in London, Ruby became suddenly quite a big star.
She was famous, wasn't she?
What did all the other women working in the factory make of that?
I think they were a little bit envious, but she was very, very good at her job.
Do you actually like the painting?
Oh, I think it's wonderful. It's all these little intricate little pieces. It's exactly as it was, you know. I think it's wonderful.
Laura Knight's hit exhibit at the Royal Academy drew in the crowds, but it was only one small part of a much wider programme to get art to the public.
Unlike the First World War, where there hadn't really been any exhibitions of war art until the war was over and there was a gigantic show at the Royal Academy, during the Second World War, Kenneth Clark decided very early on that war art must go on the road. And in the summer of 1940, he opened a large war art show, which was hugely popular, just hugely popular.
It was the National Gallery, now lying empty after its old masters had been evacuated, that would become the first venue to exhibit war art. Clark's ambitions were to transform the gallery into a wartime cultural hub. Just a few weeks after the outbreak of war, he began a series of daily classical concerts by Myra Hess. The National Gallery became a huge draw for a hungry public.
People were just streaming into the gallery, none of whom perhaps had been there before the war, which is interesting. The location of the National Gallery itself favoured this, and there were posters outside saying War Artist Exhibition, concerts, temporary exhibitions, canteen, best sandwiches in London. I'm sure that was a bit of a draw too.
For Clark, the enormous popularity of the National Gallery was a personal vindication, but it was just the springboard for even wider ambitions.
Art was always associated with London, and small towns especially did not get to see a lot of original art. And so the War Arts Advisory Committee sent small exhibitions of war art out to approximately 120 small towns and villages and the occasional large city throughout the country. But what really made it important was that it went to restaurants or schools or canteens or public service organizations, and people who had never set foot in an art gallery and who in many cases told reporters that they would never think of setting foot in an art gallery went to see these things.
Kenneth Clark had a plan, and that plan was starting to come together. He wanted art to be a vital part of national life, and now art was everywhere. But Britain's suave champion of the arts had an even bigger social agenda.
Clark wanted artists as well as art to have a living, breathing connection with ordinary people, to be embedded in their everyday lives. Stanley Spencer was one of Britain's most idiosyncratic painters. His biblically infused visions of his hometown of Cookham reflected an intense belief in the idea of community. This feeling for ordinary people impressed Clark, who wanted an artist who could depict the shipbuilding towns of the Clyde. In Easter 1940, Spencer arrived in a place that was about as far removed from the leafy home counties as could be imagined.
It was cold, it was colossal, and it was deafening, but Spencer loved it. He later said that the process of building a ship reminded him of his mother making a dress, an observation that's strangely domestic, but the more you think about it, is actually surprisingly astute.
A series of short-term commissions would stretch into a 2-year period, during which Spencer immersed himself in the working-class community of Port Glasgow. John Anderson, a 14-year-old apprentice fresh out of school, was given the job of assisting the occasionally chaotic artist.
So you looked after Stanley Spencer for 2 years?
Yes, near enough.
And tell me a little bit about what he was like as a man.
Dishevelled.
Dishevelled?
He always had a mop of hair, like how could I say, like a kitchen mop. And so, when the wind blew, he was dishevelled looking.
And I imagine the wind was blowing quite a lot up here.
He called it Siberia. And he was always at the furnace for a heat. And he wore his pyjamas under his clothes.
He wore his pyjamas under his clothes?
Yes.
What, just to keep warm?
Just to keep yourself warm, yeah.
And how did he sort of fit in with the guys who were actually working at the shipyards? Because he was...
They were annoyed at him. They thought he was a spy for the government and to see what they were doing.
So to begin with, there was a bit of mistrust?
Yes. But once you get friendly with people and he started going about taking drawings, he drew a lot of the men. And he had good friends. I thought he was a great chap. But he had no money. So what he did, he would do a sketch of you in his hand. See? And he'd get you to go to the cooperative and maybe buy him a sandwich or a roll, whatever it is, and bring it back to him.
So what, Stanley Spencer was so skint that he'd never have to pay for lunch because he'd just do little sketches of all the men?
Bribing them.
And did he ever sketch you?
Yeah, I lost it.
What?
Yeah, he sketched me and I lost it. But there were hundreds of drawings of men working, that riveters, welders, caulkers, burners. He sketched them all, no bother.
Spencer's long stay in Port Glasgow inspired large-scale artworks that strayed far beyond the committee's original commission. Alongside his official paintings of the shipyards were works which imagined the town's graveyard bursting into ecstatic life on Judgment Day. Spencer's paintings of the Clydeside community are a monumental achievement that somehow combine the mystical with something much more material.
Stanley Spencer may have been a visionary who claimed to see angels, but he was obsessed with the heavy-duty, profoundly earthbound relationship between men and industry and technology. And he wasn't the only one. There's a whole new generation of artists who became preoccupied with the technologically sophisticated trappings of modern warfare, from radar to gun sights to aircraft design and state-of-the-art submarines.
How humans relate to technology is one of the underlying themes of the Second World War programme. With the advent of radar, with surveillance, with photography, with film, with flight, all these weapons are available, and combined they are lethal. Suddenly you're having artists looking at technology. Suddenly it's a matter of life and death.
This is the operations room at RAF Uxbridge, and it was here that the Battle of Britain was actually orchestrated. Gone were the days of troops armed with bayonets, eyeballing their opposite numbers in the trenches of World War I. This was a new type of warfare, remote, mechanical, conducted at the push of a button via electric signals and radio transmissions. A war in which life or death decisions were made deep underground in dimly lit bunkers.
This was the world explored by the painter John Piper. Piper was one of Clark's select group of salaried artists. Before the war, his work had favoured a romantic style, featuring landscapes and architectural ruins. But as conflict approached, his paintings began to change.
Just before the war, Piper starts to produce work that is more abstract. Some of it is designs for theatre sets and some of it is oil paintings. But they take the shape of forms, blocks of colour, but essentially abstract works. And what's interesting is when he's commissioned to do the bunkers, he's going down into these spaces underground, marked out in these strange ways. There's these symbols, numbers, arrows, markings. So you enter this strange space with an artist who is your guide to it, and you're immediately aware of this different sort of environment in which people are working, in which these symbols mean something, they signify something, they are part of an organisation, they are part of a process, part of this equation that solves a problem above ground.
At the time, Piper's bunker paintings must have seemed fairly radical, challenging even. But they pushed the stylistic boundaries of war art just about as far as they'd go. For all his willingness to employ avant-garde artists like Piper, Sutherland, Moore and Nash, there was only so much formal experimentation that Kenneth Clark could accept within the war art scheme.
Kenneth Clark criticized what he called pure artists, and by that he meant artists who seemed to have no interest in the daily lives of people, had no interest in connecting with them. Because I think it's important to remember that for Clark, a major driving force behind the creation of the War Artists Advisory Committee was precisely to connect art with people, to convince them that art has something to say about this huge trauma through which they are all living.
By the end of the war, more than 400 painters, printmakers and illustrators had contributed to Kenneth Clark's war art project. Given the sheer number of artists involved and the stylistic restrictions placed on them, maybe it's not so surprising that many of the works of art produced during the Second World War are relatively conservative and predictable.
At one level, it's very safe. The art is very traditional. Many artists at times face scenes that are so shocking, so awful, that actually this language, this simple and recognisable language, is very, very important. They don't need to be making major statements in the way that they work or their aesthetics. It's there in the subject matter. And the skill is in how they manage the viewer's introduction into scenes of devastation and of horror.
By the spring of 1945, Allied forces had advanced across the German border. Some of the most harrowing artworks of the war would emerge from the scenes that they now encountered. When the British arrived at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, they discovered 60,000 prisoners penned behind the barbed wire. Many were dying where they stood or lay, and thousands of emaciated corpses were left unburied in the open air. With the British liberators came war artists, some serving soldiers who felt compelled to bear witness. Others commissioned by Clark's committee, relief agencies and newspapers and magazines to record the devastation.
It might seem like a very obvious thing to say, but coming here has brought home this truth. It's impossible to describe what happened here. And as a result, I'm struggling to understand what possible role war artists could play in a place like Bergen-Belsen, because Surely their attempts to filter their experiences and try to express what they saw just end up belittling the brute reality that occurred here. In the face of this relentless horror, doesn't art just end up inevitably feeling a bit glib, even irrelevant?
Photographers and filmmakers recorded the liberation of Belsen and its aftermath. Their documentary images have lost none of their power to shock. Perhaps overshadowed by the stark immediacy of the photographs and films, the art produced at Belsen is only now beginning to be recognised.
For a lot of years, the war artists were neglected. Photographs and the films were the material that were used in newspapers, in books, in documentaries, etc. But when we now observe our visitors in the exhibition, they walk through the chapter where the photos are shown, and they look a little bit, but not that much, and then they suddenly stand in front of this display with the war artist paintings, and I think they suddenly have a different approach towards what's happening. It's completely different from the photographers. We don't know exactly when the first war artist came here, but it was very shortly after the liberation. That was Eric Taylor, and he actually didn't come here as a really official war artist. And
he was a soldier.
He was a soldier. He came with the fighting troops, and then later Leslie Cole came as an official war artist here, and he made paintings.
This whole area, this whole subject is very, very difficult and very, very sensitive, and this may sound like a strange thing to ask. Are there any examples of some of the works of art that these official war artists, or even the unofficial ones like Eric Taylor, made that you feel are successful, if you like, as works of art?
I personally like especially the paintings from Taylor and Cole, because they were showing the horrors, the piles of corpses and the mass graves, but they also were showing individuals. They were given an idea of the individual people.
Another British artist at Belsen was Doris Zinkeisen. Before 1939, Zinkeisen had specialised in upbeat Art Deco designs. During the war, she became a nurse, looking after Blitz victims in London. In 1945, she was commissioned by the Red Cross to document the faltering medical effort to treat Belsen's inmates.
There's a painting by Zinkeisen, which for me is almost the most disturbing work I know in the collection. It's called A Human Laundry. It's a scene where former inmates of Belsen are being treated by these nurses who look, in comparison to the emaciated bodies, are very well fed, healthy looking women. And you think, well, this is an unpleasant scene. But it takes on a very different meaning when you realise that the nurses are actually Germans. And I think that's something that an artist brings to this. You can look at a photograph and just move on. You look at a painting and realise there's a purpose and a making that has gone on, and a period of reflection that makes it all the more uncomfortable.
There's something about the story of Doris Zinkeisen that, for me, somehow sums up that horrible trajectory from the 30s into the 40s. Earlier in her career, she was painting colourful theatre backdrops and fabulous murals for the Queen Mary, which was one of the most glamorous ocean liners of the era. And then in 1945, she arrives here at Belsen. She only stayed for several days, but like many other people, her experiences here scarred her for the rest of her life.
A few days after the German surrender, a consignment of paintings was unearthed from its hiding place under a Welsh mountain. But just as the nation's masterpieces were beginning the journey home, the astonishing collection of art produced during the war was being broken up.
In the months following the end of the war, the War Artists Advisory Committee set itself the task of distributing the 6,000 works of art as broadly as possible so that people would have access to it in a variety of locations in perpetuity. And so one has works scattered literally all over the country. Clearly, this dispersal of the collection was a continuation of Clark's determination throughout the war to interest people in art, to make it feel that it mattered.
Britain had been locked in a fight for survival, and against all the odds, it had prevailed. Art, too, had won an unlikely victory.
What Clark achieved during the Second World War had a huge legacy in terms of how support for art developed in Britain in the 1950s and beyond. People never forgot those exhibitions of war art. They never forgot that the government had paid for it and made it possible.
Kenneth Clark had accomplished extraordinary things during the war, but in the end, it was an artist working alone, outside Clark's official scheme, who ended up changing the face of British art forever. In April 1945, just a few weeks before VE Day, Henry Moore and Graham Sutherland headlined a show of new British art. Among the other artists included in the exhibition was a relatively unknown painter called Francis Bacon. During the war, Bacon had been a civil defence volunteer in Blitz-ruined London. The work he created during the conflict sparked a critical firestorm. This was war art that could never be forgotten, an anguished scream that's still audible nearly 70 years later.
You can see at once why this triptych caused such a sensation. In these three very claustrophobic panels, against this background of scorching orange, Bacon painted this agonised trio of twisted and tortured forms that are part man, part beast. It was shown for the first time in London towards the end of the war, just when devastating photographs from the concentration camps were being published around the world, and this must have immediately seemed like art for a generation suddenly acquainted with unimaginable atrocities. Of course, Bacon didn't have anything to do with the War Artists Advisory Committee, but the war changed him, so much so that he suppressed his earlier work. And here, he confronts the horrors of the conflict head-on. I find this an unflinching, apocalyptic masterpiece, a despairing howl about the barbarity of mankind. And it's been enormously influential, even on artists today such as Damien Hirst. After Bacon, after Belson, British art would never be the same again.